And a big welcome to our live audience for the Digital Health Investor Talk Show. I'm your host, Stephen Wardell. I'm the managing partner of Wardell Advisors, a digital health advisory firm, and the author of The Future of Digital Health. Wardell Advisors is helping digital health companies address issues around growth, fundraising, trade sales, and strategic alternatives, giving you more options in today's challenging environment. You can follow me on x.com/Stephen Wardell. Our show topic today is how employers are advancing mental health. And our guests today are Jared Bressner, who's a principal at Activate Venture Partners, and Pierce Crowley, an associate at Activate Venture Partners, a top New York venture fund. This show is being recorded and will be included in our podcast series called the Digital Health Investor Talk Show. You can subscribe to the podcast on Apple and Spotify and leave us a review. We always love getting 5-star reviews. We have new podcast links for the show, so make sure you see recent episodes when you subscribe, or you could be subscribing to the old links. This show is not investment advice, and we are not investment advisors. Here's the format of today's show. It's 90 minutes, and Jared, Pierce, and I will spend the first part discussing the news and the macro picture and some other topics, and then we'll focus on our special topic of the day. And we'll be taking your questions throughout the show in the LinkedIn text chat, so feel free to type questions starting now in the LinkedIn text chat. So, Jared, welcome to the show, and please introduce yourself. And if you have any hooks into today's topic, we'd love to hear about those as well.
Yeah, thanks a bunch, Steve. Really appreciate you having us back on. And every time I talk to you, it always feels like I learned a lot more than I ever gave. Activate, we're an early stage venture capital fund. We have a focus on technology-enabled healthcare. Pierce and I work together every day, identifying the needs of our healthcare ecosystem and trying to find ways to tackle them. And that means working with really exciting and talented entrepreneurs on doing just that. I'm a physician by background, an orthopedic surgeon, and I spent about a decade and a half of my life down in Baltimore at Hopkins. And in addition to taking care of patients, I built a biomedical engineering lab. We developed a number of new orthopedic implants, and I worked as well with industry designing some surgical devices and instruments. And I really like the technology side of healthcare because when you get things right, you can touch millions of people at a time. And when you do that at scale, you get venture capital. So I really love what we do. And we get to do some really exciting things and make a difference in healthcare.
Great, thank you. And Pierce, can you introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us here, Steve. Looking forward to chatting. As Jared mentioned, I'm an associate here at Activate Venture Partners, focused on early stage healthcare investing. I studied psychology in undergrad, spent time with a couple private equity funds, one of which in the healthcare space, where I looked at actually a lot of behavioral health deals. Took a little bit of a detour right out of college, joined an apparel startup as the 10th employee at a company called Grayson. We were doing about $1 million in sales when I joined, and I built out our production supply chain teams over the course of 3 years and scaled revenues to 40 million, employees over 100. So had a blast doing that, but wanted to circle back to healthcare and an interest in investing. So went back to school, did my MBA at Columbia Business School. I was part of the healthcare and pharmaceutical management program there. And I joined Activate a couple summers ago, initially as an intern, and then stayed on throughout my time at business school. I'm also on the New York City Junior Council of a nonprofit called Shatterproof. It's one of the largest substance use disorder focused nonprofits in the US. So I've been heavily involved there for a few years and have spent a lot of time in the behavioral health, mental health space. So looking forward to chatting more.
That's great. Thank you. Well, so we're going to jump into our first section, which is macro news. In the good old days, which is just 3 or 4 years ago, no one used to think for an hour a day or any time at all about macro news. But unfortunately, these days, we seem to be concerned more and more with the macro picture. And so I'll just start off with the NASDAQ, currently at about 19,000. 2 years ago, it was at 10,000, so that's up significantly. I think no one would have guessed that it would nearly double in 2 years. But it's also down about 5% from earlier this month, so a significant pull-in and a lot of anxiety in the market right now based on current news. So down from 20,000 earlier this month. And I think it's concern over a number of things. Trump promised to be a disruptor, and he's being a disruptor. So there's some disruption that's happening. There's also the Ukraine war. There's there's a big debate over whether it's a draw and stalemate, or whether Ukraine was winning or Russia was winning. But Trump seems to have sort of inserted a lot of, or he's introduced new plans, which are very concerning to the people who want, sort of rapid or full funding and rapid victory for Ukraine in the war. There's also the story of the skipped or delayed recession, which is that usually in economic cycles, you can never, ever, ever skip a recession, however much you'd like to skip a recession. But it seemed like we were skipping a recession for the longest time. Fidelity commented that they'd never really seen a case like this where we went from expansion to seemingly going to a recession, but then not experiencing a recession. The explanation was given that it was because of war spending. Spending on 2 wars by the U.S. had a Keynesian stimulatory effect on the economy, massive government spending, and that we might actually skip a recession because of that, because of a positive spending shock. And now there's growing concern that maybe we didn't skip anything at all, just postponed it, and we may actually see that recession finally arrive. Then there's also, I think, concern over what I'll call a government spending shock or lack of spending shock, which is that every day the headlines circle around Doge and Elon Musk fighting waste, fraud, and abuse, and Democrats saying that he's gone beyond that and he's getting into things that maybe were mandated by Congress and shouldn't be touching or whatever. But whether it's all legitimate or not legitimate, it is cutting back government spending. And those are, you might have someone who expected to have a nice 6-figure salary and was going to upgrade their car this year and was going to go on a big vacation this year to Florida. And now they're not doing either one of those. And that's so because the government's not funding that maybe their job was cut, the government's not funding their job anymore, and then they're not spending on these purchases anymore. And so that's, that could contribute to a possible, a regional recession, a Washington, D.C. regional recession, or a national recession, possibly. And then also tariffs and trade war as well, where Trump seems to like the idea of raising tariffs. And in the long term, tariffs could do important things like move some pharma manufacturing onshore. During the pandemic, a lot of people thought, hey, why is our pharma manufacturing in India, where we get second-class customer status from them? Why isn't something essential like that in the US? So that could be a good idea. But in the short term, it tends to create a painful disruption. If you raise tariffs in the short term, it can be inflationary. You don't know if domestic supply is going to rush in or if it's going to happen at all. So those are some of the issues. And big picture, there's just a lot of uncertainty. This administration is 1 month old, and there's a lot of new uncertainty. And so, anyway, Jared, Pierce, any of your thoughts about macro news?
Yeah, Steve, I think you hit the nail on the head with the word uncertainty. There's a lot going on right now, and investors came into the year with a lot of optimism, and we saw the indexes at all-time highs, and we've seen a pullback the last couple of weeks, and I think that's really due to the flurry of executive orders and people trying to still parse out how those are going to affect businesses, particularly the tariffs and the next Fed meeting in 3 weeks. So I think we're in a little bit of a watch and see moment, and that's okay.
Jared, any other thoughts? And then in healthcare, I'd say there's an extra level of uncertainty, which is what will RFK do? So RFK has he has a list of, easily over 30 things he could do. He doesn't have enough political capital to push all of those things at the same time. So what's his priority? What will he actually do? What will he really try to push through? What will he not do in the near term? That's sort of the question on people's mind. And, I noticed there was a story about his blocking formularies from reformulating GLP-1s. That's an interesting step. I know there's talk about his blocking direct-to-consumer advertising by pharma that was raised in the campaign. That has caused a lot of nervousness on the part of pharma companies that have drugs with heavy consumer advertising. They're concerned that in 6 months or a year they might have significantly less revenue because they can't reach their target audience with ads, etc. So there's a question of what will RFK do, what will his priorities be, what will his emphasis be, his timing priorities, his spending of political capital priorities. So that's, I think, some of the healthcare issues. So are there any particular healthcare policy issues? So the next Fed meeting is March 18th to 19th. I think the innovation community really wants to see the Fed continue to cut rates. So a 25 basis point cut would be what the community is hoping and expecting. Inflation is still a concern. So you could see the Fed be cautious on inflation and not give us the 25 basis point cut and push that off into the future. So any other thoughts on macro issues, Jared and Pierce?
Well, I think you summarized it really nicely when you said there's a whole lot of uncertainty going on. And I think while the macro news doesn't really affect what we do on a day-to-day basis, it certainly has short-term and long-term implications. And the exit climate matters for what we do. But we really follow what's going on as it relates to our portfolio companies. And, I know you're asking about anything politically going on that we really are really tuned in on. And rather than sort of following specific, party agendas or initiatives, or really following what's going on as it relates to our portfolio companies or new investments on the horizon. And I think, like many things, the eventual resolution will probably be maybe not as dramatic of a departure from the status quo as many people fear. But of course we're watching, and I'm particularly concerned with what might be going on in Medicaid. The House approved the budget reconciliation bill yesterday, encompassing significant tax cuts and a lot of implied big Medicaid spending reductions. Certainly has sparked a lot of really intense debates among the populace, but also among the Congress. And as the bill goes to the Senate, I think its future is still, to use that term again, uncertain. Republicans, I think, will propose lots of amendments, particularly with regard to the extent of the Medicaid cuts or the structure of tax reforms. The reconciliation process allows for expedited consideration of budget-related legislation, so it only needs a simple majority. But given the really narrow margins and the kind of contentiousness of things, really any dissent could derail the bill's progress. And so I think compromise will have to be made. And like many things, the way it shakes out, thankfully, is not always extreme or dramatic departures from the status quo. And that's kind of by design of our government. And peripherally related, we are following what's going on in the 3B drug pricing program. It's what allows hospitals to buy outpatient drugs at a discount for uninsured or low-income patients. And we're following what's going on, obviously, in Medicare Advantage. There's been a lot of mixed sentiment with the new administration coming on. It seemed very likely that there'd be a very robust reinvigoration of Medicare Advantage, but there's been a lot of mixed press about the whole risk adjustment process. And this week, Senator Grassley actually demanded United Health fork over Medicare Advantage records to explain how they're documenting diagnoses. So these are things that really directly have potential to affect some of our portfolio companies. And that's the way that I tend to think of following, big picture news and political news going on as it relates to our day job. Pierce, I know, you follow it a lot too, and have always some really insightful or great thoughts too. So
I think those are, really the main ones that we're keeping our eye on, and they can have an outsized impact on our portfolio companies. But as well as, and kind of particularly for this podcast, right, the Medicare telehealth flexibility. So Congress has extended numerous times in the past several years and is likely to continue. But that deadline is March 31st, 2025 for an extension. So we'll be watching to see what happens there, because that could also really disproportionately affect behavioral health businesses.
Yeah, thanks. And then, so also for our audience, there's an interesting, what I'll call sort of derivative story here in digital health, which is that the healthcare industry is the major enterprises of healthcare. So that is providers, including hospitals, payers, including insurance companies, employers, which is a kind of a payer, government spending, also pharma manufacturing, pharmacies. These are the major budgets. And then digital health is often, if it's a software company, it's usually a software vendor selling into these major budgets. So it's selling into the clinical budget of the pharma company, or it's selling into the CIO budget of the hospital or something like that. And so the reason this matters is that if those large enterprises have uncertainty, then one of the easiest things for them to do is cut spending on new tech. So an example of this would be RFK says in the campaign that he is going to block pharma brands that advertise direct to consumer from their direct to consumer advertising. So there's digital health vendors out there who serve those pharma brands in their direct to consumer advertising. And those pharma companies are planning budgets every year, and their plan for a single brand, their plan might be to spend $1 million more in direct to consumer advertising with the help of agencies and digital health software vendors. $1 million more this year than last year. And then they hear this, and it's the easiest thing in the world for them to just postpone making a decision and spending the money for 3 months or something. And that has a small impact on their year, but that has a giant impact on the vendors who sell to them, possibly reducing their revenue in the first quarter by a very significant amount, and then making it uncertain whether they're going to catch up that revenue by the end of the 12 months or ever. So that's the state. We benefit when the industry decides that technology offers answers and they're going to start spending more on technology. We benefit because they may just shift some dollars internally and we see our revenues go up 50%. So that's the good side of this risk. The bad side of this risk is that they might feel uncertainty and stop spending on new tech, and then your vendor might see its revenues go down by 50%. So that's the but we're a derivative on the healthcare industry. We in digital health are a derivative on the healthcare industry, and so the effect on us can be twice or 10 times as big as the effect on the industry itself.
And we're guilty, I think, to some extent of the same phenomenon. While we have a much longer time horizon as venture investors, when there's uncertainty in certain segment of the healthcare ecosystem that we're looking at, and we may deprioritize that as an area of interest to us just because we don't know. Even though our time horizon is not what's happening a year from now, maybe more 5 or even 10 years from now, we're guilty of it too.
And there's also what I would say with these big enterprises of the healthcare industry, there's kind of a direct and an indirect effect as well. And sometimes the direct effect is they feel uncertainty, their own budget is cut, they feel uncertainty, and the direct effect is that they spend less on new tech. But the indirect effect is that often in stressful environments, tech is the better solution. And so they might, an example of this right now is with AI coding and billing, for example. So this is a critical part of what hospitals do. It falls under the CFO budget of revenue cycle management. And on the one hand, there just aren't enough human coders around to code. A lot of people retired during COVID, and a lot of young people don't want to go into coding as a career. So there aren't enough coders. And so on the direct effect of hospitals feeling poorer and stressed and uncertainty is for them to not spend money on tech. But the indirect effect is that they're actually getting more value and they're getting the opportunity to sort of meet tougher budget criteria by spending more on AI coding. So but you've got these direct and indirect effects that are run counter to each other, and it's not clear which is bigger. And sometimes in the short term, the uncertainty can mean don't spend. And then in the medium or longer term, it can be spend on tech instead of the alternative, which is to spend on old processes that might be more human labor centric. So tech often is an advantaged category in the medium to long term. Now moving on to our next category. And by the way, for our audience, if you guys have any questions on this, feel free to ask questions in the chat about macro issues or political policies. There certainly is a lot of change in sort of the priorities of the administration and the policies of the administration in Washington. So also, by the way, let me just mention, since we're still on the politics topic, I think with RFK, what we're going to see, so fundamentally, the federal government funds a very large amount of basic research. And that research is uncovering sort of the mysteries of life for us. And then after years and years of successful basic research, finally, some of this stuff is ready to translate into the clinic. And so this is where sometimes innovators and medical researchers and investors get behind certain products and back them. That's only after a lot of basic research has been done for a long time. And the US federal government funding of biological and medical research in America is generally praised, but it's also criticized. It's generally praised for having done a lot of good, but it's criticized because it often seems to be the same grantors giving money to the same grantees year after year after year. Some of these sectors have been dry wells, and some of them seem to be funded because of relationships forged 30 years ago or 50 years ago. And so there's some criticism. Hey, if you're a genius young researcher looking for federal grants in a new area, it's going to be much harder for you to get that money than it would be for someone who has been successfully winning grants for 40 years, et cetera. And so it shouldn't necessarily be. So there's been criticism as well. Well, under RFK, I think what we're going to see is the biggest ever episode of stopping funding old researchers, in part because RFK is going to have new priorities. Also because some of those older people who provide grant money are going to be gone. And then the biggest ever shift to new priorities. So that is what the winner of a political battle gets to do. They get to shift to new priorities. But here's the thing for the innovation economy from that. It is that it takes years of basic research. And so you're now going to have a ceasing of funding in certain categories of basic research. So you're not going to see more IP coming out of those. And then you're going to see new areas focused on. Maybe that's good. Maybe these are the right new areas to focus on. But you're not going to get stuff ready for innovation after 1 year or after 2 years or after 3 years. You're going to have to keep investing in this. Maybe 5 years, 6 years, you're going to see stuff that's ready to be commercialized out of these new labs that are starting to get funding under the change of priorities of RFK. And so there's the gap I'm looking at on the life science side. There's this gap where old stuff's is going to lose funding, new stuff's going to get funding, but it takes just years of basic research to get to the point where a VC is ready to back it or a management team is ready to jump on it and license the IP and go and run with it. So I think that is something that we're going to be faced with. And this is mostly, we're talking about life science here as opposed to software development. But I think that's an interesting story. The biggest change in priorities of spending of basic life science research by HHS and NIH ever. And it's going to create a gap in IP ready for the commercialization industry to grab and run with. Anyway, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, but that's something that I see looking into the future.
It's an interesting thought. Well, at the same time, many grants are, multi-year awards. That is an interesting thought. And, if you look inter-department, for example, orthopedics is only part of the NIHAMS portion that gives out, grant awards. And you could argue that arthritis is one of the most prevalent diseases, period, which is an orthopedic disease, but is not proportionally represented in terms of how the grant money is awarded. So maybe things like evaluating those changes maybe are going to become interesting. But at the same time, many grants are multi-year awards. And so I would hope that there may not be as big of a lag as maybe we fear in terms of generating innovation.
More of a smooth change rather than a cliff change. Interesting. Great. So we'll move on to our next section, which is business and trade journal news. And so I thought, since I have two VCs on the line, I would just ask you guys, what have you seen in terms of, what are you seeing, what are you hearing in terms of trends in digital health investing in general since the start of the year?
Well, I think there's definitely still people kind of spreading doom and gloom. And I guess I will say, to be honest, we're not really seeing problems in that. We're seeing still a lot of really exciting companies and a lot of really exciting opportunities. But maybe if I could speak to just a general trend is that, and it's something we've been talking about for a while, the conversations around valuations, size of funding rounds, use of proceeds, capital efficiency, and a strive to reach, profitability expediently have become much easier conversations to have at the early stage.
Yeah, and I think the lines of pre-seed and seed continue to blur more and more. And I think part of that is due to the advent of generative AI and some of these new technologies that are allowing folks to get from concept to MVP exponentially quicker, and thus turn on the revenue machine even earlier. So I think you're seeing folks get to a point of commercialization earlier and thus maturity more quickly. But like Jared mentioned, I mean, we're seeing a lot of great deal flow and a lot that has more reasonable kind of valuation and fundraising expectations. I think people are really becoming cognizant of the market in which we find ourselves in, and people don't want to be setting themselves up for down rounds. They don't want to be setting themselves up to be on the venture capital flywheel for indefinitely, and so a little bit more of an eye towards profitability and sustainable growth versus just the kind of growth at all cost mindset.
So that reminds me of a joke I heard at JP Morgan, which was that there's at JP Morgan software companies raising money this year. Some of the companies were pre-generative AI and some were post-generative AI. And the way you could tell is that the companies that were post-generative AI had one bullet point on their main slide, and that was generative AI. And then the companies that had been around since before generative AI had 6 bullet points on their main slide. And that was because they used to have 5 bullet points on their main slide. And now they've added the 6th one, which is generative AI. Really interesting trends there. And so now I'll jump into just some trade journal stories and what trends can we draw, what insights and trends can we draw from these. The first was really interesting. Medical information platform Open Evidence raised a Series A is valued at $1 billion. So I had not heard of this company before. They didn't actually reveal the size of the Series A. They said that Series A plus all prior rounds was 100 million. So this is feeling a little bubbly here to be a Series A and post money valued at $1 billion. And this was raised from Sequoia Capital. And Open Evidence is a free medical information platform that offers an AI-enabled medical co-pilot for doctors in the US. It aggregates and synthesizes clinical evidence to help doctors make more evidence-based decisions. The company was created in the Mayo Clinic Accelerator Program, founded by Daniel Nadler. Really interesting. I think the trend I see here is just the trend of AI. And this one, the fact that it is free to use is you don't usually see that. We have a cautious fundraising environment right now nationally. You usually don't see large round size, large post money valuation, free to use product in such an environment. But here we are seeing this. So I would just throw this under the trend of generative AI is making products available that weren't available before, and people see a lot of high potential for that. And a lot of deals look like this. This is sort of an extreme example because of the size of the fundraise in the round. So any thoughts on this, Jared and Pierce?
We're just a little bit wary of provider-facing technologies. I think we're excited about the way that we can help doctors spend more time with patients and optimize them. And at the same time, we're very much cognizant of the fact that malpractice liabilities still fall on the provider, right? And as well as Jared actually pointed out to me recently that the nurses practicing actually under the provider's license, the provider also bears the risk there. Similarly, they still, they similarly bear the risk for any technology that they're using. And so it's really important that these providers understand the reasoning going into a lot of these models and can actually corroborate that if they're implementing it in a care setting. Because at the end of the day, the technology companies are looking to innovate and optimize providers, but providers really need to make sure that that's being implemented in a really safe way in which they can kind of truly understand the reasoning and the mechanisms behind the outputs, and that they agree and can stand behind the outputs.
I think to echo that point that Pierce was making, and I'm not too familiar with the company, Steve, but kind of ingrained in medical education is a eye to going to the literature and seeing the level of evidence for yourself. Even when I was a resident, there was kind of among the older surgeons, kind of a philosophy that, reading societal guidelines, reading review articles was nice just to get a high level, but you should really be reading the primary literature because you're seeing how the studies are created. You're seeing how well they were constructed, really what sort of confidence you can derive from the evidence. And having a co-pilot is really useful, I think, for getting quick and snappy answers. But as Pierce stated really astutely, in order to have confidence and make strong clinical decisions with really good sound judgment, I think you really do need to know where those recommendations are coming from.
Yeah, thank you. I've heard an interesting framework. Here we're talking about providers using AI tools. So I've heard an interesting framework, and I think this news story is consistent with that framework. It's worth reiterating that framework, and that is that there's kind of a spectrum, and on one side of the spectrum is tools that don't affect human life all that much. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's AI tools that do affect human life very strongly. And so on the side that doesn't affect human life very strongly, you have billing. That would be an obvious one. Billing, administrative work, note-taking. And then on the side that does affect human life, you have clinical decision support tools. And so what we're seeing is a very rapid advancement of generative AI to recreate the tools and create tools with greater capacities on the side that doesn't touch human life. And then on the side that does, you're seeing caution. You're seeing caution, and people are sort of waiting to see what happens there. And also that the role of the doctor is still critical. And so, interestingly, a doctor may get multiple sources of input and then make a decision, and the doctor's still liable, even if they got wrong advice, wrong information from one of those sources. And so I heard one doctor talk about how doctors are going to be liable for their choice of AI tool. Oh, well, I'm going with the purple AI tool, but not the green AI tool, because I feel more comfortable with the liability I get from that, because the doctor is going to be ultimately liable and will also be liable for the tools they chose to use. So, and in that sense, the doctor is not going the way. The doctor is there for a number of reasons. It's to make decisions, be responsible, be liable. And, there's human patients here, and those patients want their decision to be made by a human, ideally a human who's a deep expert and who they trust. So those are reasons that don't have to do with memorizing medical textbooks, that for why the doctor's role is going to stay in place.
I love that. And
so
just to echo your point, that we used to joke in the operating room that surgical robots were going to become autonomous, but we're still going to need somebody to plug the machine in and turn it on. Doctors can do that part.
Well, that has completed a riddle, which is that there's a joke that there's an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie called The Terminator, and in it the Air Force builds a supercomputer, and the supercomputer wakes up and decides to destroy humanity. And the modern joke is that this story is directionally correct, but it's actually a hospital billing AI that wakes up and decides to destroy humanity, not an Air Force supercomputer. And then, but what you've completed there is that what's the mechanism by which the hospital billing AI actually destroys humanity? And the answer is that it activates the surgical robots to go out. So then I'll move on to some other business stories here. So a new digital health company, Frontera, has announced that it is launching with $32 million in seed funding. That sounds kind of high to me. Frontera is an AI-enabled autism care company. So if this is a care company, then a bigger round could make sense. And the funding was provided by Lux Capital, Lightspeed Venture Partners, and Menlo Ventures, and others. And these are outstanding mainstream digital health venture funds. So one of the themes of the last 2 to 3 years has been that you often see a corporate venture fund that doesn't usually lead is leading, or you see a non-digital health venture fund has come in to complete a round, or you see you see a family office doing a round. And what that usually means is that the CEO tried like hell to raise money from mainstream venture funds and couldn't. And so they finally found a corporate venture fund that doesn't usually lead, but will lead in their case because they're beloved by a champion at the mothership or something like that. But this is nice for me to see. So first of all, the first trend here is you have tech-enabled services and care and new care delivery models and AI involved in new care delivery models, more specialized than primary care. This is an autism care company. So those are some big trends we've seen a growing number of investors like there, but also outstanding mainstream digital health venture funds jumping on board for this. We haven't seen that a lot in the past, but I'm glad to see that here. It means that mainstream venture funds that raised a lot of money 3 and 4 years ago and haven't invested a lot of it are starting to pull the trigger and invest in it. In this case, they're investing in a services company as opposed to a software company. And then I'll just throw in the last one for me. So tech-enabled maternity clinic Millie has raised 12 million Series A. The round was led by TMV and Foreground Capital with participation from Pivotal Ventures and the March of Dimes Innovation Fund. So this is interesting. Once again, a tech-enabled clinic, this time a maternity clinic. And these are not mainstream digital health venture funds. TMB, Foreground, Pivotal. I don't see them, frequently investing in digital health. But again, tech-enabled services, not software for companies. Interesting to see. And then just not a lot of fundraisers. So in the last 2 weeks, looking backwards, did not see a lot of announced fundraisers in digital health, which suggests we're still far from the boom years, which was 3 and 4 years ago, et cetera, where you used to see over a dozen announced per week. So any thoughts about Frontera and Millie and any other insights we can draw from those fundraisers?
I guess a significant trend I can point to that I've been seeing or hearing kind of in the community is that, and I think it's a model that really started a long time ago, but a lot of digital health focused funds are really kind of becoming closer and closer aligned with a strategic arm, whether it's a health system or a payer. And they're really becoming closely intertwined to working together. And in some cases, using a proving ground as they build businesses. And I think we're probably going to see a lot more of that. I think it's healthcare is a really great place for that model to work. I'm not sure if that's a trend that you've seen, Steve, but I kind of like it.
Yeah, I think I've seen that. I've also seen some health systems growing out their innovation arms, and I've also seen a growth in studios. So studios is often like a sort of a captive. They could have their own funding, but they're building digital health products at the studio before spinning companies out to be their own companies. That's an interesting trend. And maybe with this move toward generative AI, which can build a product at less expense than before, there's an opportunity for companies to get farther along at these early stages and then go out and get outside venture funding with more pieces of the puzzle put together. So very interesting. Pierce, any other thoughts on
Not on these particular, but I did want to call out another funding announcement in Bicycle Health, which raised their Series C, $16.5 million. And I thought this one was interesting for a number of reasons, one of which that the company has reached profitability, which kind of goes back to a little bit earlier of what we were alluding to, in that some of these businesses are switching mindsets to finding profitability and being able to really be self-sufficient, right? Ideally, this is the last round that they raise. And I think it sets you up well for a number of reasons, but particularly if you run into some headwinds. And I think with this business, there are potential political headwinds, right? Where the telehealth prescribing of buprenorphine might change. And I think that's important to call out and for people to understand, because that would have an outsized impact on the substance use disorder recovery community. There were over 100,000 overdose deaths in the U.S. in 2023, and preliminary data from 2024 is encouraging. It could be as high as a 25% decrease in that number. And I think a big part of that is because more and more people are utilizing these opioid agonists like epinephrine that can decrease an individual's risk of overdose death by upwards of 80%, which is huge impact, right? And so there's 1.7 million folks utilizing these drugs today, and that was 1.1 million in 2017, and a lot of that was driven by an increase during COVID and accessibility to these drugs due to these telehealth prescribing regulations. So, tying back into kind of some of the regulatory we're watching is these telehealth regulations and prescribing regulations, particularly with opioid agonists, could really have a large impact on not just businesses, but the individuals that are getting much needed care from them.
Great. Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. And for our audience, are there any other trade journal articles or stories you'd like us to comment on? And then for Jared and Pierce, do you guys have any other business trade journal articles that you want to call out?
I'll mention that it seems like the revolving door of GLP news really continues. I remember sitting at Health back in October, and there were multiple panels talking about how it's such a super compelling business to be compounding GLP-1s and giving them out via telehealth outlets. But the past few days, we've effectively seen the FDA trigger a wipeout of about $7 billion from HIMSS market cap by reclassifying the semaglutide shortage on Friday, which covered multiple doses of Wegovy and Ozempic by Novo Nordisk, as resolved. And so that means compounding of semaglutide is no longer really permitted under the current regulations. And this is just a couple months after the FDA said that shortages of Zepbound and Mounjaro from Eli Lilly had ended. And at the same time, Lilly Direct has really expanded and knocked off about half of the monthly list price. So it's as low as $350 or $500 depending on the dose a month. And these drugs were kind of listed as a shortage starting around, I think it was 2022, really a swelling of demand. And so the law allowed for compounding pharmacies to step in and fill supply gaps. But, that's really changed. And, you have to credit helping thousands or even millions of people get access to these GLP-1 drugs that are really, in many cases, transformative. And custom formulations of them are certainly different, but this is pretty big news.
And Jared, any color on that in the sense that was this a reasonable expected decision, or was it a surprise, or are people saying this is a political decision not justified by adequate supply, or any thoughts on that?
To be honest, I can't really comment on political nature of it. But I guess this is kind of how things go. There's a shortage, and until you can figure out how to generate the supply organically, fill gaps where you need, and anticipate that ultimately things settle out. I don't know that, from sitting back in October at some of these panels, I would have forecasted that it would have come just, 3 or 4 months later, but so it goes.
And I remember all of the, many companies scrambling to be able to try to provide, compounded versions of these drugs, and also Lilly coming out with Lilly Direct, providing a GLP-1. And I don't understand pharma going direct, and it's been a bigger hit than anyone would have thought. But that seems to me to put pharma in competition with its own doctors who prescribe drugs. And so if anyone in the audience, or if you guys can explain how it doesn't create channel conflict with doctors, I'd love to hear.
I guess I would agree with you. Really striking that comes to mind over the last couple of weeks. I know you talk about the Rock Health reports pretty regularly, and I guess the only thing that I can really in recent memory comment from that are a couple findings. One is the just general trends of last year in the venture ecosystem being maybe a large percentage of the activity was at the early stage, which is where we focus, and maybe some smaller later stage rounds, but that there's really kind of a trend of mega funds going on in the digital health venture ecosystem. A16Z and General Catalyst captured about 20% of all LP dollars last year, and so you've got almost two microcosms of venture investing, and the companies as a result. So I think that's notable.
Yeah, and I also saw there was some news about just funds that invested a lot at the peak of valuations, and what's going to happen with those funds, and will they be able to raise next funds? But very interesting. I hadn't heard that two funds together were significant. General Catalyst and Andreessen Horowitz were a significant proportion of LP dollars. So very interesting. Well, good. Well, so I'm going to skip a little bit in our show plan just for time reasons, and just move on to a fun part of the show. Is there any technology that you use in your daily life that's affordable? Maybe it costs less than $100 or so, or even if it's expensive, that you want to talk to the audience about. So I'll mention just a couple quick things. One is that I'm increasingly trying to use ChatGPT for iPhone on voice mode, and you can actually tie it in to, on newer iPhone models, you can tie it in to the action button, so that your phone is in lock screen mode and you press the action button and you can talk to ChatGPT. And I was intrigued that Sam Altman is saying that that's how he wants ChatGPT to be used in the future, is that you're sort of having it sit there on the table. You have you're a decision maker, you have an advisor human with you, and then you have ChatGPT with you, and you throw questions to ChatGPT just like you might throw questions to your human advisor. Maybe that's your CFO, for example, plus ChatGPT. So really interesting. And I'd also would mention that I was asked to pay recently by someone holding up their phone next to mine, and then our two phones with the screens near each other showed a possible transaction, and then it showed money flipping from one phone to the other phone. So I thought that was very cool. I don't quite understand that. And then also subways are increasingly queuing in to the field of your credit card, so that instead of using your credit card to buy a multi-fare ticket, you just wave your credit card in front of the fare, the gate, the subway gate, and then it opens up for you and bills your credit card $3 or whatever. So those are some interesting technologies out there that I think sort of improve life in general. And so wondering if you guys have any that you want to share with our audience.
I think, Steve, after the show, I may need you to show me how to use my phone better. But I recently got a new car. It's a Jeep, and it has an autopilot. And I've never had a car with autopilot before. And it's amazing. I get on the road, I put the autopilot on, and it just becomes such a more relaxing experience to drive. Even if there's traffic, it feels much less of a headache to drive in traffic because you're not the one doing all the stop and starting. And it's just really, for me, it's like a game changer. And I even enjoy driving. So it's the first car I've ever had with an autopilot, and I love it.
And are there restrictions on you, like you must be in the driver's seat, you must have your hands on the wheel, or are there no restrictions like that?
Not on me specifically, and I think there's a version of it that's completely hands-free that has, cameras or something that points at your face. But for mine, you just have to have a hand on the steering wheel, and it has a sensor. And if you, are starting to, get a little lazy and your hand isn't really touching as well, it can sense it, and it will change the color and eventually make noise at you. But I can't, sing its praises enough. I just love having an autopilot in my car.
Very cool. Pierce, any tech for us?
Not as exciting as Jared's autopilot, or I guess I should also be speaking to my phone more. I don't know, kind of just boilerplate, utilizing ChatGPT and Perplexity to really distill an industry that I'm kind of initially looking at and get kind of a 1,000-foot overview quickly and get a direction of sort of where I need to start looking and spending more time, and it's kind of some good sources behind those to then go and do sort of more first principles research and diligence. So maybe not super exciting, but definitely helpful and saves quite a bit of time.
Yeah, thank you. And just to build on that for a moment, I'll mention a couple things. So one is I like Perplexity as my browser's primary search and answer engine. So you can actually, instead of having to visit the Perplexity site, you can actually make it be your primary search engine in place of Google in your Chrome browser or whatever your browser is. That saves an extra step. I like that for Perplexity. I have found a problem. So I have a thesis that a lot of these AI tools are going to be very good for someone who's already an expert in making them twice as productive. But they're semi-dangerous for someone who's getting up the learning curve and is not an expert, because you don't know what you don't know. And so an example of this is that in my head, it'd be very clear to me. I ask, you could ask a question like, who is doing musculoskeletal pain software apps for employers or something, and to give me a competitive analysis on that. And I have found that in my head, what I'm looking for is I'm looking primarily for software type companies that are selling maybe on a PMPM basis into employers. But I don't want care services companies, because I care about software companies for this analysis. And then I also care about who sells to employers, not who sells to payer, not who sells to health plans or who sells to providers or who sells to government or something like that. And the AI agent can't make these distinctions. It just doesn't know. It doesn't get. So a good human analyst can make these distinctions, but the results you get layer in the software companies, but also the care service provider companies. And I didn't want them together. I wanted them separate. And it layers in ones who sell to employers, and then it brings in ones who sell to health plans and ones who sell to providers as well. It's not able to make that distinction. Now, if you then look in the literature, the trade journals, the websites, whatever, they're also not making that distinction. And so the reason that AI can't make that distinction is it's based on materials, on root research materials that also don't make those distinctions. So that was an interesting, and so therefore you almost don't want to go the AI path. If you know in advance it's going to give you a result where you're going to spend your time fixing what's broken, you might just want to build it yourself from scratch, and then you know what you have and you know that it's excellent. So that was just an example of a problem that I'm finding. What it means is that we're all racing against the machine, and that I have a few years left before the machine can. So anyway, thank you for that, guys. Now, the next thing we'll look at is upcoming conferences. So I'll throw out a couple here, but so one is the HIMSS conference. So in my sector, the HIMSS conference, everyone's talking about HIMSS. Are you going to HIMSS? What are you going to do at HIMSS? What are the parties at HIMSS? People are talking about HIMSS right now. This is after an exhausting lineup that we've had. We had the health conference, JP Morgan, and Vive all happened within just a few months, and now HIMSS. And so I'll mention HIMSS is a direct competitor of the Vive conference. HIMSS is old, been around a long time. HIMSS is a true trade show. You'll have buyers of software go there to make decisions about buying software. Vive is trying to be a trade show. Vive is not successfully a trade show. A lot of investors also go to HIMSS. HIMSS is focused overwhelmingly on the hospital CIO budget. They try to throw in all hospital budgets and even a little bit of health plan budgets, but it's really focused overwhelmingly on hospital CIO budgets. So that's HIMSS. It's March 3rd to 6th in Las Vegas. And what I'd say for young companies, if you don't know about this conference or thinking of going, if you sell to the hospital CIO or other hospital budgets, it's worth going. And then just try to write in advance for hospitals that buy software that are your prospects, and try to write in advance for VCs who invest in provider tech companies and try to get meetings there. And you don't always have to buy the ticket. You could, for example, go to a cafe outside of HIMSS and then line up a few meetings a day. Ideally, minimum 4 meetings, maximum 10 meetings a day. But if you can get 4, it's probably worth going. And then have those meetings with those product purchasers and those investors. So those are my thoughts. But HIMSS is equal to Vive, and in some ways better than Vive because of its long history. So, do you guys have any thoughts on HIMSS, whether our audience should be going to HIMSS?
Well, maybe one of our teammates will be at HIMSS, but I guess we don't have a strong conviction either way, Steve.
So then Health 2.0 coming up March 4th to 6th in Las Vegas, same time as HIMSS. So for Health 2.0, I think I don't recommend that people go to Health 2.0. My understanding of the story of Health 2.0 is that Matthew Holt, who was a friend of mine who built Health 2.0, sold the company to HIMSS in the past, and HIMSS then did not protect the trademark of Health 2.0, and another unrelated company bought that trademark and has rebuilt from scratch the Health 2.0 Health Innovation Conference, and has been hosting these conferences. I don't really know people in my network who go to the Health 2.0 conference, but in general, because of the way that it was started, which is that it doesn't take advantage of the Matthew Holt and HIMSS assets to bring to the conference, but it was started from scratch using the term Health 2.0 taken from HIMSS, which had bought it. I don't think it's worth going to, and within my own network, I'm not hearing of people going to Health 2.0. So I don't know if you guys are in March 4th to 6th in Las Vegas. I'm not sure if you guys know people going to Health 2.0 in Las Vegas or have any recommendation for our audience. No? So then I'll also mention South by Southwest coming up. So South by Southwest is a music and interactive media conference that has tried to expand over time to be a pharma brand conference and a medtech conference. And I think it's worth it to potentially go to South by Southwest. What you can do is, if you're in those areas, if you sell to pharma brands or you're medtech and looking to launch your product, you can write to Austin VCs. That's a good step to go, or other VCs, and you can also write to brands who are going and those are steps you could take with South by Southwest. That's coming up March 7th to 15th in Austin. They may have this year South by Southwest Health, which represents the pharma brands and the medtech cluster that they're doing there. And so that's a subsector of days. I'd be sure that I went, if they're doing that this year, I'd be sure that I went to Austin during those days, the days of the South by Southwest Health subgroup as well. So do you guys have any thoughts? Have you been to, I've been twice to South by Southwest as a healthcare conference, not as an interactive media conference. Have you guys been there? Do you have any recommendations for young company leaders, whether they should go or not?
We have not historically gone.
And it's pretty unusual. Those two areas, selling to pharma brands or being a med device company, that's a relatively small subsectors of the digital health economy. Well, good. Well, so, and then personal notices. So I'll just mention my next Boston Health Innovation Night is coming up Thursday, March 20th with Sumit Nagpal of Cherish Health. talking about the silver tsunami and age tech. So for those of my audience in Boston who will be in Boston on March 20th, you can find tickets there at stephenwardell.eventbrite.com. Jared and Pierce, do you guys have any personal notices how our audience can reach you, or things you're doing where you want to meet with the community?
Well, tomorrow morning I'll be speaking on a healthcare panel for the Philadelphia Alliance for Capital and Technology PACT about scaling healthcare businesses, and I think speaking through the lens of both a physician and an investor. And I'd certainly welcome anybody that would like to. Just feel free to email me or get in touch with me online. I'm sure LinkedIn or any venue, and I'd be happy to chat.
Sounds great. So now we're moving into our main topic, which is how employers are advancing mental health. Americans face a mental health crisis made worse by COVID stress and lockdowns. Will tech ride to the rescue of employers? And so just to kick this off, what is going on with employers looking for better options in dealing with employee mental health and behavioral health? What are you guys seeing in the market? What can you tell us about how this market's evolving?
Well, how about if we start by tackling in a few parts. I think first it might be helpful just to define who specifically we're talking about, and then why we think behavioral health, mental health is a really attractive market, and why specifically the employers are a really great place for innovation. And Pierce, please, we can riff back and forth by all means. But when we're talking about employers here, we're primarily talking about self-insured employers, though not exclusively. A self-insured employer is a company that takes on the financial risk of providing health insurance for its employees, rather than purchasing them through a traditionally fully insured policy or plan from an insurance carrier. So instead of paying fixed premiums to an insurance company, the employer pays the employee's medical claims directly, and then will often use a third-party administrator, often called a TPA, to manage claims processing, and also the network component of things, which is really a key part of the business. And then I think there's some really unique dynamics about mental health that make it a really attractive market for investors, and also just a really great place for innovators to solve a lot of profound problems. There's a huge need. There's a big provider shortage and a mismatch. Pierce does a really great job of keeping tabs on sort of the latest and greatest statistics. And maybe Pierce, if you want to just share some of the numbers just to put everything in context, because it's really staggering.
Yeah. I mean, and just it's a huge issue for Americans, and then when we think about employers, right, self-insured employers, that's 100 million people who are getting their insurance through their employer, right? So anything that is largely affecting the U.S. population is similarly affecting the self-insured employer population. It's no secret that the prevalence of mental illness has been increasing, and COVID, we saw a really big escalation in both mental health diagnosis, including a wide spectrum of mood disorders, substance use disorders. And now we're at a place where 60 million U.S. adults suffer from mental illness. So it's almost 1 in 4 adults. And there's this paradigm where 50% of those people are last year received treatment, right, or sought out a treatment. So when we think about this disparity between providers and patients, there are 122,000 licensed psychologists in the U.S., and the average panel of one of these psychologists is on the upper end, actually 200 per year, right? It's not a PCP where you can see 1,000 plus patients because of the cadence, obviously, that you're doing these therapy sessions. So, by that math, they can see 24 million patients per year. Immediately, that is not enough to cover the 30 million patients who sought treatment last year, let alone the 60 million overall patients that need this help. And that's not even taking into consideration the supply constraint imposed by needing to see a provider in the state in which you're currently residing, whether it's telehealth or in person. So that adds even more strain. While a state like California has 10,000 psychologists, obviously it's a larger state. Some states, such as Wyoming, have as few as 60 licensed psychologists, which is, just a kind of a mind-boggling low number. And so it really just goes to drive home the idea that there are a lot of people who cannot be matched with the care that they need.
And to compound that, problems with network access really exacerbate that mix match. Many venues face network constraints, driving high out-of-network utilization, which is expensive to payers or employers, and also patients, or driving them to cash pay options, which is also obviously expensive for patients. And so the way network contracting is done really cements these challenges by forcing, as Pierce alluded to, traditionally intrastate licensing and credentialing. And there is maybe a unique solution that is relatively new in this space using an interstate licensure compact called SIPACT. We recently actually, full disclosure, invested in a company called Mind and Match that has been able to leverage this body of SIPACT licensed providers to kind of create a nimble network to kind of circumvent some of these network constraints and have national flexibility to go plug into existing strap networks and fill this demand. But traditionally, having to construct networks locally or regionally where the demand is really exacerbates the dynamic that Pierce was discussing of supply and demand, patient provider mismatching. One of the things that makes this even more dire, but also a really great time to be investing, is the 2024 update to the mental health parity law introduced a number of things that really are forcing strengthening of the access to the mental health care and substance use care that patients need. So, there's stronger parity enforcement principles, meaning that plans must have detailed analyses to ensure that the health coverage is comparable to medical benefits and surgical benefits. Again, to ensure parity, really you have to be able to balance supply and demand. And when that's not matched, that creates a problem and therefore a strong opportunity for businesses going in and tackling this problem. Plans must also dole out the benefits consistently across all care categories. So if you think inpatient in-network, inpatient out-of-network, outpatient in-network, et cetera, it must be universal. And so there are a lot of things that really are trying to drive access to care. And in order to effectively do that, we need to do something, whether it's providing better access to the providers themselves or using technology to kind of reach a better equilibrium. And telehealth, I think, is a really unique tool to do so. In general, the stigma resolving around mental health care, very appropriately so. And, it's much less conspicuous, not to mention far more convenient to sit on your couch in a virtual waiting room than in the waiting room at a doctor's office. And, I guess I'd say furthermore, given the particular nature of psychological or psychiatric services, there's certainly a strong element of psychological comfort or safety that comes from sitting at your own home rather than in a foreign or maybe intrusive environment. And then I guess
I think just to jump in, I think that the employers are at a particular disadvantage, right? When you think about the mental health parity law and how they can adapt to that, in that they are far less nimble than the Bucas of the world or folks who can go out and bring providers in network and in mass and are used to this credentialing, whereas the employers themselves are far less sophisticated and they're further away from this process, and thus it's more difficult for them to quickly react. And we're seeing that the issue as far as parity is really pronounced in employers. I mean, we talked to some TPAs who mentioned that as much as 60% of their behavioral health claims are out of network versus physical health claims where it's hovering around 20%, right? So immediately that delta is not going to hold its weight in this parity enforcement. And so they immediately need a way to close and bridge those gaps, bring those claims in network. And thus a solution like Mind and Match is great, where you can plug it right in and it can immediately fill those gaps and it can transcend state lines and really aggregate the limited supply that we have.
And the biggest employers can have their plans administrated by the ASOs of the big Buca plans, Blue Cross, United, Cigna, Aetna. But the middle market, say less than 1,000 employees, really has to use independent TPAs, like Pierce was saying, to assemble the networks and administrate the plans. So this really can be a really attractive customer, because if you can solve those network problems and provide a turnkey solution for the business, that's really attractive. And so the employers that are using those independent TPAs may traditionally have EAP programs, employee assistance programs, to try and help when their mental health needs of their employees. But they're fundamentally limited and constrained. So providing a really cost-effective, maybe turnkey service that's eligible for core benefits as opposed to sort of ancillary benefits or EAP type engagements, that's really attractive.
Yeah, and hence why, we've kind of zeroed in a little bit on the employer space as a customer in general, but particularly for the purposes of this conversation in the behavioral health space. Because as Jared mentioned, these employers have really been inundated with low utilization point solutions, right? There are quite a few tech companies trying to sell into employers, whether that is the large, S&P 500 companies that are fully insured or the self-insured kind of mid to smaller size self-insured employers. And a lot of these solutions really haven't moved the needle, particularly for employee mental health, right? And that's just factual data. We see general public mental health continuing to deteriorate. So even after utilizing all of these different solutions that they're paying for, as Jared mentioned, on a PEPM basis, right? So per employee per month basis. So they're paying for it whether their employees are utilizing it, let alone getting value from it. And the results just aren't there. And we're seeing that a lot of these point solutions are garnering less than 5% utilization. So we think that the employer space is a great space to be right now, but that doesn't mean that's an easy place. And what I mean by that is that a lot of these employers are really taking a hard look at their existing solutions and seeing where they are not getting value. And so if you are selling into this customer base and you're able to really clearly demonstrate and communicate value, you're easily able to kind of separate yourself from the crowd as a benefit that employees are going to use and that are going to actually drive outcomes. And we think that this could lead to a shift in the payment paradigm as employees move away from, the clunky PPM businesses or the EAP businesses and more to fee-for-service, bundling of payments, and outcome-based payments as they really look to get value from their solutions and the outcome.
So let me jump in and ask a couple of questions here. So when employers hear about a diabetes solution for the employer to buy and make available to the employee, it's actually an alternative to seeing a doctor more often. So the diabetes solution often exists in this area of helping with self-care and helping with coaching, neither of which is what a provider directly does. And so then when you think of musculoskeletal care, again, you're talking about an employer providing a product to employees that might help them with a backstretch program that means they don't have to have surgery or they don't have to see a care professional. And so these are kind of they're alternatives to licensed professionals. But what you're talking about providing access to those licensed professionals, not an alternative to them. So we're not talking about a chat bot for depression. We're talking about a professional, retaining and fully paying a professional. But in the past, it might have been hard to have access to that professional, or you would have had to have gone outside of network for that professional. And you're talking about making it easier to see that licensed professional for 45 minutes, not provide an alternative to seeing that professional, a technology alternative that's cheaper than the professional. Is that right? What you've focused on here is the opportunity for someone to see a professional, a licensed professional for 45 minutes, let's say, and not the opportunity for employers to provide an alternative to that professional. Is that right?
In this instance, yes, but I don't think it's as easy as one or the other. So of course, we would prefer that people are routed to the highest quality of care, and in this case, a psychologist who can administer these sessions. And as I outlined before, there just aren't enough psychologists, right? So there is merit to solutions that can supplement, whether it's traditional treatment, or can supplement with technology to traditional providers. I won't say that I'm totally sold on the AI therapist chatbot as one of those solutions. But I do think that the way people are thinking about it is the right way, right? We don't have enough providers. And so how do we supplement that and still give people good quality care? And the emphasis is in what I said of good quality care, right? And so I think a lot of it, and we can talk about this at length, but it's quantifying outcomes. right? Following the science and quantifying outcomes. So we know that people are there are better outcomes when they're going and doing talk therapy, right? That has been studied. And so we want to follow the science and we want to stay there. There is less evidence for some of these new technologies that are automating some of that. While promising, we need to make sure that outcomes are in line with what traditional providers would be. And we need to make sure that we have ways in which that we can quantify that and make sure that it's safe and that increasing accessibility to care doesn't mean a decrease in care.
I think the to maybe come full circle back to the question you were asking, Steve, is there's definitely an element of expediency and completeness of filling the existing problems in access to care. And there's certainly, you could probably name off the top of your head multiple point solutions where you can go that are kind of self-contained outlets for receiving mental health services. However, they suffer the same limitations in terms of matching access to geography, eligibility, network constraints. And so, it creates economic problems. And so if you can create a workforce that can be, plugged in and inserted to fill the actual network problems of access. I think that's what Pierce was talking about on a almost instantaneous basis. That's why I think that solution works really well for this particular problem. And I guess to also maybe kind of come full circle to where Pierce left off is there is really, I'd say, a very wide range of quality, in the mental health care space. I mean, you just go on the internet or social media and you see it's chock full of self-proclaimed experts who are taking oftentimes liberties with their educational and training backgrounds to label, diagnose, or recommend treatment for mental health conditions in manners that may not be consistent with evidence or appropriate standards. And, maybe just to use maybe a very common example, the term gaslighting has spread like a wildfire. Even the mainstream media, you'll see it in newspaper columns all the time, and it's regularly used incredibly incorrectly, not in the precise, psychological definition. And so things like this, perhaps innocently, often manipulate some of the ambiguities inherent in mental health care. And in some cases, I think probably do cause more harm than help. And so really having a qualified, verified source of care that you can ensure is providing good outcomes is top of mind for what everybody needs. And then really Pierce and I spent a lot of time talking and thinking about where the payment paradigm in behavioral health will go long term, taking a PMPM on one extreme to a fee for service on maybe somewhere in the middle of this evolutionary progression, to maybe eventually bundling services, because there are multiple providers that interact with or touch a patient that involve something related to their mental health. I mean, if you have spine surgery, and it's a really debilitating and long and painful recovery process, it's very common for patients to suffer from depression that needs care. Mental health and physical health are very intimately intertwined. They feed back and forth on each other. And it's not as clear and simple as separating them as two totally separate entities. And so there, I think, are really creative ways that you can care for the whole patient in a payment method that accounts for doing so. And I think that is really the way of the future. You just have to have the data and the evidence to kind of carry the weight.
And you mentioned the mental health parity law. And so can you give a little more context on this to our audience? It sounds like plans didn't want to provide good coverage of mental health. And so advocates got the government to insist that plans do provide coverage and payment for mental health care. And what exactly does it do? But what's the motivation behind it, and the need behind having a mental health parity law? And what's the latest story of what was strengthened in the 2024 law?
I don't want to venture to guess or assume what the intentions were of not of the employers. I think it was truly just innocent that there was it evolved such that there was a difference just in terms of access to different types of care. And some of that may just be the field of mental health in terms of its recognition to use the term parity, on parity to importance of physical health, maybe wasn't as commonly accepted or understood. And so I think just kind of naturally, as the care evolved, it was recognized that there just was, not the same access innocently to the services. And so the mental health parity law is not, a brand new law, but it's been continually updated over years. And 2024 just kind of strengthens some of the convictions of parity in mental health and physical health care. And so what it really did is it put the onus on the plans to demonstrate that you are getting, if mental health care access is provided by the payer, that you are getting it on an equal footing to what you might expect from going to see a doctor, as you mentioned, for your diabetes. And so that, have to facilitate your ability to seek care. And I genuinely don't think it was that an employer didn't want to provide this service. It just is kind of the state of affairs that became recognized and reconciled.
And you mentioned that the unique opportunity of telehealth in mental health and behavioral health. And so I want to mention there that there's an older generation of people, and they have no problem with driving to a therapist's office on Main Street of their town and parking and paying for parking and waiting in a waiting room and being called into a therapy clinic office and talking and then leaving at the end of the session. But I think young people don't want that at all. And young people want their therapy to come from their phone, basically.
Yeah, probably.
It's an interesting opportunity.
It's important to really recognize, which is kind of startling when, at least when we first appreciated this, but there may not even be the possibility to drive to somebody and see them for care. If you're in, as Pierce mentioned, there's 60 providers in Wyoming, you may be driving hours just to find somebody who's able to provide you care. And there may be 60 providers in the state, but not all 60 are taking new patients or may not have availability for months from now. And so it may not be as simple as preference as truly access to care. Just may not be attainable.
And something that we also haven't touched on is that, maybe there is a local psychologist in your town that you can drive to, and you have no qualms with people seeing you do so. But maybe that provider is only okay, or maybe his specific kind of treatment functionality and focus is not where you need help, right? So if you are somebody who is suffering from substance use disorder, and maybe you have some gender identity issues as well, and you're looking for a CBT provider, we're talking about a provider shortage here. So the odds that you're going to get somebody like that, right, somebody who is really focused on where you see yourself needing the most help, is very low, right? So the second that you can transcend state borders and really just have a large pool of providers versus a constrained one to your geography, the higher the chances that you are matched with somebody who is really the most equipped to deal with whatever it is you're going through.
Well, so we're hitting our time limit. So for our audience, if you have any last questions for our guests here, please type it in the chat. And for Jared and Pierce, any kind of summary you want to do of where you see the opportunity? So employers are looking to provide mental health to their employees, and there's a lot of obstacles, and where you see the opportunities for employers to offer better mental and behavioral health care to employers.
Yeah, I think employers are uniquely incentivized. They want to obviously provide good health care for their employees, but their employees are also their workers, and they want them to be able to produce good work. And so they have kind of a dual incentive, if you will. But also they're a lot more nimble and innovative, and oftentimes willing to adopt new technology, new solutions, new ideas than a very large and often bureaucratic organization, like a commercial carrier might be. And I think really where Pierce and I spent a lot of time, and I don't want to necessarily speak for Pierce, but looking is solutions that really fill the gap in access, that really provide verifiable quality of care, because you can even, like, some of the brand names that you can rattle off your hands may not provide the same demonstrable quality or fit of provider. And also we're really, as we've touched on, really looking at ways that we can pull out data and show true evidence-based outcome centric results to the employers that may influence the whole continuum of access to care and also the full continuum of reimbursement of that care.
Jared summed it up very nicely, as he has the unique ability to do, but I'll kind of just reinforce the idea of quantifiable outcomes and this idea that an employer can be a great customer given that sort of dual mandate interest area, whatever you'd like to call it, and that they're very much invested in their employees' patients. They have budget and they are more nimble. They're more willing to try new technologies. And so if you're able to quantify outcomes and show real results and show that you are going to benefit their workforce, I think it's a really exciting place for forward-looking employers who want to kind of get ahead of the curve and adopt some of these groundbreaking technologies.
Yeah, thank you. I like the way you put that. And let me just bring in something. So when I was on Wall Street, I was the only analyst to cover all of the public companies that sell healthcare solutions into employers. And a couple of things employers care about. They actually care, they want to somehow, in the way they directly contract with digital health vendors, they want to feel like they're getting a better deal than the plain old healthcare system. And so if you can say that you're getting a better deal because of telehealth or because of analytics and cost effectiveness metrics we can show you about this service as compared to the plain old healthcare system, employers like that. They also will buy based on company morale as well. There's a balanced scorecard within employers, and they could say something like, we're a specific company, we know we have a problem in this area, we want to make this tool available to our employees so they can make use of it to sort of help with our overall attracting and retaining talent and boosting company morale. A third issue is that they actually deal with absenteeism issues and presentee issues. And so people ask, what's presentee and what's presenteeism? So absenteeism is, maybe there's someone who has depression and we want them to be in the office and not have depression and be productive. So we want to make this available to them. Presenteeism is employees who show up and are present on the job at work, but are not productive on the job at work. And both of these are significant problems. And so employers just in general, they care more than a payer would. For a payer, as long as they're meeting what other payers are doing in the sector, they actually don't mind so much if there's expenses and costs to healthcare, because they can just charge a margin on top of that usually. But employers care much more because this is affecting their morale, their absenteeism, their presenteeism, and also every dollar of healthcare cost hits directly on the bottom line. Well, so that's great. So no further questions from our audience. So I guess we'll wind up. But so Jared and Pierce, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, Steve. That was a blast.
And so you've been listening to the Digital Health Investor Talk show with Stephen Wardell, and our special thanks to Jared and Pierce today. And we'll be publishing this show as an episode of the Digital Health Investor Talk show on Apple and Spotify. And if you're in Boston on March 20th, come to our Boston Health Innovation Night on the Silver Tsunami and Age Tech at the Liberty Hotel that evening. Look forward to seeing you there. And you can find access to future episodes of this show and future events on stephenwardell.eventbrite.com. So thanks so much, and we'll see you later. And thank you, Jared and Pierce.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.